Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, a warm welcome to you all. My name is Janne Nijman. I'm the chair of the board and academic director of the Asser Institute, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today. And I'm really delighted that we're back here in the Academy Hall in person for another annual lecture. That's really wonderful. In particular, Brigid, a warm welcome to you, our speaker of today. I will introduce you in a few minutes. I'm very grateful that you're here. This lecture was initially scheduled for November 25th, 2021. However, while we had organized the 6th annual lecture with Andrew Murray fully online, this time, rather than to do another online event, we thought to move it, decided to move it to today, to the spring of 2022. After all, our annual T.M.C. Asser lecture traditionally aims to combine an excellent lecture on a topical subject by a world-renowned speaker with informal discussions over drinks afterwards. And so, I want to say a big thank you. I saw already some people of the municipality, Hilde Marij, Rob, Pepijn. You're now lost in the audience. But a big thank you to the municipality of The Hague, City of Peace and Justice, for supporting this annual lecture throughout the years. We're really grateful for having a partner in the city, a partner for this kind of event, in-depth critical reflection on topical issues of law, peace, and justice. Now, for the annual Asser lecture, we invite our speakers to examine, as Tobias Asser did in his days, and what he called the condition of society, and to reflect on its legal, political, and perhaps institutional implications, and to discuss responses needed to address related contemporary issues. And today, May 10th, is particularly fitting for a lecture on Europe in the world. Yesterday, be it overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and by Putin's speech, we celebrated Europe Day 2022 and commemorated the signing of the Schuman Declaration on May 9th, 1950. Now, that declaration starts by saying, and I quote, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it." Peace requires creative efforts, and law may contribute to that creativity, to that imagination. Peace requires creative efforts, and the European Union is such a monumentally creative effort. We must maintain and care for it actively and continuously. So when Brigid and I talked in the spring of 2021, I explained that I was hoping to program a lecture on Europe after Brexit, a lecture that would confront the increasing Eurosceptic voices and discuss Europe's role in today's rapidly changing geopolitical and geoeconomic order. A lecture on how to remain Europe that is democratic, open, and based on human rights and international law, while the world seems to be rapidly changing into a hard power reality, in which dependencies can become risks and threats. Traditionally, Europe is a soft power global actor, with global standard setting and territorial legal rule as its instruments for foreign policy, or I should say external relations. This surely raises a set of questions in itself. But according to some commentators, in the coming years, Europe's strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty, and perhaps its safety, require more hefty instruments than that. At the time, Brigid was carefully following the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, I remember with concern. This lingers through in the original title of the lecture, Europe, Player or Plaything. And as you know, the Usher Institute is a research institute for international and European law. And these questions on the identity of Europe as a global actor are at the heart of the research focus, Global Europe, led by our researchers, Dr. Eva Cassotti and Dr. Narine Idriss. Eva has interviewed Professor Laffan for Opinio Juris and is the academic coordinator of the CLEAR Inter-University Research Network on EU law, on law of EU external relations, based at the Institute. And Narine's research areas are a number, and among which also EU law of EU external relations and EU asylum and migration law and policies. And Dr. Idriss will moderate the discussion after the lecture. Now, how much has the world changed since spring 2021? Russia has started a war of aggression against Ukraine with devastating human suffering as a result. A war with geopolitical consequences that painfully bring out also the problematique of Europe's power and its identity as a global actor. When we exchanged earlier this year, Brigid, you indicated that you have thrown away the original lecture. And that's a lot to ask when you invite someone, and actually written a new lecture. I'm extremely grateful that you are here with us today and that you're willing to share your ideas and thoughts on Europe and the world. Professor Brigid Laffan knows Europe inside out. She does not just study Europe, she shapes it, as the authoritative website Politico stated in 2018. This is, among other things, thanks to her profound understanding of the EU and how the internal, legal, political, and economic dynamics relate to the external policies of the EU and its role and position in the world. Until this summer, Brigid Laffan was director and professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and director of the Global Governance Program at the European University Institute in Florence, where she worked since 2013. Laffan is a leading thinker on the dynamic of European integration. She has been a long-time professor of political science in Ireland, where she grew up and where she moved back recently. Professor Laffan published numerous articles and books on Europe, too many to mention, but let me mention Europe's Experimental Union, Rethinking Integration, and Europe's Union in Crisis, Tested and Contested. Laffan was awarded the Theseus Award for Outstanding Research on European Integration and the UASIS Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2010, she received the Ordre National du Mérite by the President of the French Republic. Quel honneur. Brigid, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to deliver this, the 7th Asser lecture. I'm wondering where voila. Okay. And it's also wonderful to be here in person, to actually be in a room with real humans. I've got used to dressing from the waist up and delivering lectures on Zoom. And this is one of the first times, not the first, but one of the first that I have had the pleasure of a live engagement. And I think that's really important because we are social beings and we do need to get back to a world where we're comfortable being in crowded rooms and comfortable discussing issues together. Now, I have changed the title of my lecture and called it, Can Collective Power Europe Emerge from Putin's War? And there's clearly a question mark, because I can't really answer that question. What I will argue is that collective power Europe is suggestive of where Europe has come from, I would argue from the response to Brexit pandemic onwards, but also suggestive of where it needs to go. But of course, there is an urgency in that question that simply did not exist when I was supposed to deliver this lecture last November. As I actually did write a lecture back then. It had some of the same themes, but it had none of the urgency that this question now poses, I think not just for Europe, but particularly for Europe, but also for the wider world. So let me take you through my roadmap. What do I want to do this afternoon? Firstly, the lecture is in 6 parts. I want to start with the shattering of illusions. I want to emphasize more than anything else, look at those colours, Ukraine's agency in all of this. I want to analyse Europe's response to those momentous events, and then also position that in terms of wider geopolitics, particularly China, but not just China. And then to try to hone in on what all of this means for the EU, and then what that tentative concept that I'm working on, what collective power Europe might mean. And then I will draw some conclusions, but of course drawing conclusions at a moment of contingency and uncertainty, one would not want in 10 years' time to have those conclusions analysed with a lot of attention. So let's begin with the shattering of illusions. And on the 24th of February 2022, lots of illusions were shattered. The first illusion was that Putin wouldn't invade, or if he did invade, it would be a limited invasion. The second was the illusion that one could still do business with Russia, that it was possible to have a constructive relationship with Putin's Russia. And also, gone is the illusion, and it was right up to the very end, that dialogue might prevent this war. If we think of the Minsk process, Germany and France invested very heavily in this process, in dialogue, and of course that's now in tatters, but also they did so and really took on board Russia's strategic interests and where Russia was, and it really made no difference. We have to ask ourselves, and this is a question for Europe's political leaders and foreign ministries right across Europe and the world, is should those illusions have been there in the first place? Putin had repeatedly attempted to penetrate and interfere in the democratic politics of our continent and beyond, the US election, and his violent playbook was there for all to see. The 2008 occupation of part of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, war in the Donbass, and a very brutal war in Syria. And I was very struck by a tweet from AKK, from Ingrid Kramp-Karrenbauer, on the day Putin invaded. She said, "I'm so angry at ourselves for our historical failure after Georgia, Crimea and the Donbass that we've not prepared anything that would have really deterred Putin." Now, that's an extraordinary admission for someone who was German defense minister until December 2021. And I read from that anger, but also shame. But of course, it wasn't just illusions that were shattered on the 24th of February 2022, but this was a very major rupture in the security architecture of Europe. A country was willing to invade a neighbour and really willing to obliterate it. But also, should we have ever arrived at that comfortable sense in Europe that war was something that happened somewhere else? Should we not have remembered the collapse of Yugoslavia and also taken more seriously Georgia, but more importantly, Crimea? But of course, the scale of the military build-up on Ukraine's borders and the scale of the invasion itself did alter perceptions in Europe and elsewhere. And it clearly demonstrated that Putin was a threat not just to European security, but to core principles of the international order, to the uneasy balances that we had not just in this part of the world, but elsewhere. Putin's war objectives were both immediate and long-term. He anticipated a speedy war, a rush to Kyiv, a decapitation of a government and a puppet regime, and install clearly a pro-Moscow regime. But Putin's objectives didn't stop in Ukraine. He clearly wanted to open the post-Cold War settlement, to increase Russia's impact and influence on Europe's security. And of course, the EU was also in Putin's sights. We've lots of evidence of the way in which Putin sought to undermine the EU with support for the radical right. And we've seen it over a very, very long time. And that's because, in a way, for Putin, what Europe stands for, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, liberal values, free speech, these are completely the other to Putin's view of the world and the kind of world he wants to imagine. So we have to conclude that the 24th of February 2022 was a transformative moment in the history of our continent. It is a before and after moment, and its legacy will last through the 21st century. And for the EU, of course, it reveals and exposes that uneven development that characterises the EU and its tendency, its default tendency to talk the good talk, but but to struggle to act. And now we have war as an instrument of statecraft being played out in plain sight on our continent. So it's really important that Europe's leaders are honest both with themselves and with the populations, that this is a transformative moment, that there will be and are costs, that there is a Putin price to be paid, and that Europe's strategic and economic interests must be brought back into alignment. There are very uncomfortable choices to be made, and they are being made across the capitals of Europe and beyond. But having ignored the warning signs for a very long time, there are no excuses left, no room for self-deception. And it's predominantly Europe and the West that will have to address the consequences. But the reason why we're addressing the consequences is because of the agency of a people and a society. And I think we must and we can't ever, ever forget the importance of Ukraine's exercise of its own agency in this. Most Europeans knew very little about Ukraine before the 24th of February 2020. But as we see, the blue and yellow are the colours of our time. And the reason why, and particularly in the western half of the continent, that we really didn't know much about Ukraine is there is a tendency in the western half of Europe to think that the periphery and the edges are somewhat different. But if you read Timothy Schneider, who is the West's, the American leading historian of Ukraine, he clearly demonstrates that Ukraine is a normal European country that experienced political, social developments not unlike the rest of Europe in the medieval or early modern and modern times. The conversion to Christianity, Renaissance and Reformation, 19th century nationalism, all trends that all this continent experienced. But of course, the attempts to forge a Ukrainian state after the First World War faltered, and Ukraine found itself absorbed into Stalin's Union. Yes, the histories of Ukraine and Russia are intertwined, but the idea that Ukraine is not a society, not a people, and has no right to statehood, Putin's belief that Ukraine is Russian, is simply ahistorical. It is wrong. And therefore, it's when we look at what the challenge is, what we're really looking at is a clash once again in Europe between darkness that we thought was over, imperialism and colonialism. And what Russia wanted, what Putin, and I shouldn't say Russia, I should be careful to say Putin, but Putin represents a return to empire and the imperial method. And we shouldn't forget what that means, and our continent's history has laid that bare. It means crushing a people, taking their land, dominating, subordinating, and humiliating. And we can't afford for that image of either nation statehood or interstate order in Europe to be the one that Putin wants. It would be a very, very different place. And the Ukrainians knew from the beginning what was at stake. They were in no doubt at what the costs and what was happening was. And we also should now be under no illusions, because we see the nature of the conduct of the war by Russia. And I think to witness the defiance of this people when confronted with soldiers and tanks, to see people walking towards those tanks and towards those soldiers, is something that I don't think we've seen on this continent, well, is something we haven't seen in this continent for a very long time. And Ukraine is fighting for the right to self-determination, for the right to exist, for the right to be a democracy and to hold the values that we have. And I don't want to reify Ukraine in any way and say that there weren't serious problems in Ukraine before the establishment, before this war. But this is an active choice by a people to be on the side of democracy, values and self-determination, the right to choose, which is something that we all would want. And of course, Zelensky has just been this masterful leader. His command of communication, the way in which he has basically, from a very weak hand, has bossed, and he has bossed, and called out the politicians and leaders in other countries. So in a nutshell, Ukraine is fighting not just for its survival, but for a certain idea of Europe that is neither colonial nor imperial. And the First World War did for a lot of European empires, and we really shouldn't want it back on the continent of Europe again. So for me, there's a very clear imperative, and that is that Ukraine cannot lose this war. I don't know what winning the war means, but it certainly can't lose. But of course, that poses dilemmas for all those countries supporting Ukraine, because what does not losing mean? And of course, NATO can't intervene directly. We have to be very cognizant of nuclear weapons and a nuclear threat. But Ukraine must be supported in every way to ensure its survival. And I'm not sure, I'm not a military person, I don't have that skill or expertise or knowledge. I don't know what it will take to defend Ukraine, but it must get it. Because I see no sign of Putin coming to the negotiating table at the moment in good faith, and I see no evidence that Russia can be persuaded to withdraw its troops. But the most important thing is that Ukraine has to have agency over the next choices. They have paid in their blood, they've paid with their cities, and they must have agency. No external negotiated settlement can be imposed. So moving on to Europe's response, and how has, and here I'm effectively, Europe, EU are interchanged, and I know there's a problem with that, but bear with me. So in terms of Europe's response, there's no doubt that it's been swifter, much more pronounced, much more comprehensive and draconian than anyone would have anticipated before the war broke out. And it's because of the nature of the war that the EU was compelled to take unprecedented and urgent action. There was also the outpouring of solidarity with the people of Ukraine from across Europe, from the societies. And so Europe's leaders met already on the 24th of February and have met consistently since. The EU command ship, the European Council, condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms, and the language has got stronger and stronger. It's identified as a war of aggression, and the perpetrators will be held to account for their crimes. And of course, the role of Belarus in all of this has also been targeted, as it should be. So the EU looked to its toolkit. What could it do? What could it do quickly? And there were the toolkit consisted of three different instruments. Firstly, sanctions, the deployment of the European Peace Facility, the Temporary Protective Directive for Refugees. And of course, there's also been a high level of coordination both with NATO and the US. In other words, the West has re-emerged. And the collective EU response has also been underpinned by additional member state responses. And of course, one shouldn't forget what the United Kingdom is doing in defence. It's supplying a lot of defence and military support. So sanctions. The EU is now on its sixth sanctions package. It hasn't agreed it yet, but there's no doubt that to date, the sanctions imposed on Russia are the most powerful ever seen in history because of the number of countries, but also the extent and nature of those sanctions. And the Russian economy, rich and poor Russians individually and collectively, it is and will be and will continue to be extraordinarily severe. Now, the threat of sanction didn't prevent aggression, and the ratcheting up of sanctions, even though it has imposed costs on the Russian economy and on ordinary citizens and on all those oligarchs. I never knew yachts could cost so much. Also, the costs to Russian companies, the voluntary withdrawal of some 300 companies from Russia, that deprives Russians of goods and services that they came to take for granted. Not that I think the withdrawal of McDonald's will have any impact on Vladimir Putin. But the sanctions are significant and are necessary. But of course, they're not the whole answer. I think the use of the European Peace Facility has really been a game changer, because if anyone had said to me, even in January of this year, that the EU would supply lethal weapons to any third country, I would have said, will not happen I would have thought in my lifetime. But it certainly meant that the EU looked to the available pots of money it had and decided that the Ukrainian armed forces needed to be able to defend their territory and their civilian population. And of course, that's also backed up by all the other countries and bilaterally by the EU member states. And of course, the third arm of the EU's response was the Temporary Protection Directive 2001 that was brought in for the very, very first time. Now, has the EU done enough? Of course, we know the Achilles heel in all of this, and that's the continuing importation of Russian oil and gas that continues to supply very large amounts of money to Russia to help its war effort. And of course, sanctions are not a one-way street. Putin can weaponize energy, has weaponized energy, the issue of the rubles, etc., etc. So I think Europe it's now discussing and debating the sixth sanctions package. But I think, and oil is part of that and necessarily part of that, how far would Putin go in weaponizing energy? I think he would probably not go as far as a blanket refusal to supply energy to the Western half because he needs the money, number one, but also he likes to sow discontent and division, and that's really what he will use energy for. But of course, Europe's response is bound up with wider geopolitics, because the war in Ukraine is not just a European war, but it has geopolitical implications. And I would say that perhaps the most important long-term strategic issue for this shock is what lessons will Europe learn, what lessons will the United States learn, and what lessons will China and other countries learn? In other words, what lessons will be drawn from this experience? Now, it would suit China and Beijing and Xi to transform this into a West versus the rest. In other words, make this an issue of American hegemony. That's not in the long-term interests of the United States, and it's certainly not in the long-term interests of Europe, that we divide into a world of democracies and authoritarians. But there is a real danger of this. You see that handshake there when Xi and Vladimir Putin met during the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing on the 4th of February, and they committed to a strategic partnership without limits. Now, where's China coming from on this? China firmly believes that the West is in secular decline and that the East is rising. And both China and Russia share a view of the decadent West, too much focus on individual rights, and a part of the world that's in decline. So Beijing is still referring to the war as a special military operation. In my view, they of course will always look at the prism of Taiwan. China regards this conflict as a matter of internal security and not international politics. It blames NATO for tensions in Europe's security order, and it really has refused to wholeheartedly condemn the invasion. On the surface, China staunchly supports Russia and conveys this through its state-controlled media. But it did abstain on the UN Assembly vote condemning the invasion. It didn't side with Russia. But I wouldn't read too much into the abstention, because that's what China does when something is regarded as not that strategically important and at arm's length. China does not approve of what they call illegal sanctions, but they haven't sought to undermine Western sanctions. So I think there is a real tension in the Chinese position between its long-term geopolitical goals on the one hand and its economic interests on the other. The partnership with Russia is, in geopolitical terms, absolutely central and vital to Beijing to counterbalance the US and its policy of containment. But on the other hand, China is economically much more dependent on the West, on the US and Europe for its short-term economic exchange. So there is potentially a misalignment between long-term strategic interests and short-term economic interests. But of course, there's also a dilemma for the West. China is too central to the global economy to be managed in quite the way Russia can be managed. Russia economically, apart from the supply of energy, is simply not that important. And of course, the Americans have signaled very strongly that there will be material consequences if China seeks to undermine Western sanctions. But maybe there was somewhat of a hubris in Beijing before this war broke out. Maybe they need to rethink the West and rethink the balance of forces. And maybe the power and structural advantages, for example, of the United States, where you see raw financial power, really playing a role, then maybe China has undervalued the external costs of its policies. But we don't know what lessons China will draw. Will they try to re-engineer the global financial system? Can they do this? What I don't see is any evidence that China will heavily intervene with Moscow and push them towards a cessation of violence. It could well be that they calculate that no one can stop Putin anyway. But if this war drags out, and if the Russian army continues to behave the way it does, then I think the Chinese have a problem. It will damage their soft power in the world, and they may have miscalculated the longer-term impact of Chinese geostrategic interests. But of course, not just China, there are many other non-aligned states, including democracies such as India, sitting on the fence. So it's very difficult to read just what kind of international order will emerge from this war. Are we looking to a world, an international system that will have some level of decoupling? Are we looking towards great power competition with two coalitions, and then non-aligned countries shifting depending on the issue? But of course, and this is the worry I have at the moment, and that is that the existential crisis for our world at the moment is climate, and climate cannot be solved without cooperation. It can't be solved through competition. So the consequences of this war, both for long-term the global strategic order or disorder, is very, very difficult to read. I would say that it's very important from a European perspective and also American that this doesn't become a West versus the rest. Now, what does all this mean for the EU? Well, this war is at odds with a very long struggle in Europe that a very fine book just published called Conquering Peace, that Europe's history for many, many centuries has been about claiming and conquering peace. And of course, as I said already, this war is at odds with what we had hoped was an end or a waning of imperial and colonial dynamics. But for Europe, it really involves pretty existential questions about the nature of Europe in the world. And we've had in the academic literature, we've had very different perspectives on the role of the EU as an international actor. One, market power Europe, and of course, market power is core to Europe's structural power in the world. That large single market that produces what's known as the Brussels effect, the exportation of regulation. But of course, there also was another concept in the literature called normative power Europe. And normative power Europe became very fashionable after the collapse of communism in the early 2000s as Europe began to develop strengthen as an international actor. Ian Manners called normative power Europe as Europe's ability to shape concepts of what is normal in the international community and in international relations. And that it was Europe's ability to establish norms and standards and prescriptions for world politics away from the bounded expectations of nation states. I'm afraid Ian Manners should rewrite normative power Europe. None of this rings particularly strongly, resonates in a world of hard geopolitics and power. It's not that Europe's normative values don't matter, but they're not enough. And nor can we preach to the world, and especially when we have an internal rule of law problem. But I will leave that for another time. So the EU has struggled to become a more coherent and consistent foreign and security actor. It has struggled with hard power, and it has struggled, and we've all struggled, with the realization that the world is not becoming more like Europe, that we can't fetishize multilateralism, that multilateralism is a good thing, it is a global public good, but in order to be a good thing, it must be effective. So I would say that the invasion on Ukraine has not brought new issues for the EU to address, but rather an urgent pressure on both the Union and its member states to further address the role that Europe wants to play in the world. And even before this, Europe faced a very challenging international environment with great power competition and also questions over US preferences in security and defense and the American pivot under Obama to Asia. And China remains the number one foreign policy issue for Washington, and we should never, ever forget this. And also, Europe's economic cooperation with China came under increasing pressure. So when Joseph Borrell became High Representative, at his first meeting of with the foreign ministers, he said that the EU had an option of becoming a player, a true geostrategic actor, or being mostly a playground. Now, Europe, in my view, has got to take seriously the geostrategic actor bit. And it's got to pay attention to its strategic capacity and its willingness to act strategically. And we have heard a lot of talk over the last, I'm just checking time because this watch doesn't stay on, so I need to be careful that I don't overstay my welcome at the podium. But Europe has had a debate on strategic autonomy, and that's evolved from the desire that Europe would not be overwhelmed. It was a desire that Europe wanted to be a player and not a plaything. And it began, in my view, the sharpness of the strategic autonomy debate began, I think, with Trump. This was a wake-up call. I remember there was, I think, a G7 somewhere in Canada, and I think it scared the living daylights out of most of the other heads of government who happened to be there that day. And Merkel came away saying that we're in an era in which we cannot fully rely on others, that's over. And of course, Macron, he identified the issue. His diagnosis, in my view, was correct. He understood that there was a problem for Europe in terms of its capacity to act. Moving from diagnosis to actually getting change really challenged Macron in his first term. And we have to ask, what will happen under Macron too? And I think we need to think about that. But there's a lot of discussion now about Europe's role in the world and the objective of strategic autonomy. But so Europe has responded to the war in Ukraine, in my view, with a unity and a purpose that I wouldn't have necessarily anticipated, or that I would have thought would be necessarily guaranteed. But Europe can't stay forever in crisis management mode and emergency politics. It's not good that it takes heads of government to stay up all night rewriting conclusions to get Europe to act. So that's why I think that the concept, and I will come back to it, of collective power Europe helps us think about the kind of power that Europe must become. Europe has never had any difficulty in exercising hard power in economic terms. Anyone who does trade with the EU, who has trade negotiations with the EU, understands hard power Europe. But of course, in the area of security and military power, that's completely different. Member state preferences differ. There is also the transatlantic dimension. and the implications of military power in terms of command and control, who's in charge, raises really difficult issues of sovereignty and difficult problems that the EU has to address. And Joseph Borrell's claim that Europe has probably advanced more in 1 week, this was the week after the invasion, in building geopolitical Europe than it did for several years. In my view, it completely overestimates what's been achieved and underestimates the challenges ahead. But of course, the war has also highlighted the continuing importance of the transatlantic alliance, NATO, and the importance of NATO to European security. It hasn't just invigorated the EU, but it has bolstered NATO, and we see that, for example, the Finns and Swedes are likely to apply pretty quickly, and we've also had the German Zeitenwende, and that all over Europe, countries are about to spend or committing to spend more on defence. I think the challenge is particularly acute for Germany because of its history. There's a strong pacifist streak in its society. It has always exercised restraint in foreign and security policy. And there's also been a happy companionship between that restraint and the economic interests of Germany. So I think Germany is being severely tested by this. And will be tested. I'm frankly shocked at some of the so-called German intellectuals and what they've said about this war. It wouldn't, in my view, if you just look at the facts, you couldn't possibly end up where they end up. But then maybe I take too strong a view on this. And Macron will need a partner in Berlin, a partner that continues to overcome the legacy of the past. But of course, Europe will also have to face up to the fact that it may not always have Joe Biden in the White House, and that the next American election and the election after, it could well force this part of the world to deal with defence and security in ways that we are simply unprepared. So, where is Europe at in terms of the thinking? Well, we saw the publication of the Strategic Compass for Security and Defence in March. This was 2 years in the making, and yet it was not accompanied by any concrete measures. The Strategic Compass talks of a quantum leap forward for EU capability and willingness to act. There's all sorts of reference. I think the one thing that the Compass does is it does identify common threats. The Commission is looking at all of its powers and what it could do. But is Europe realistically going to take a quantum leap forward in this? Well, we've seen it before, the 2003 European Security Strategy, an 2007 document from defence ministers. And we have to ask, will this war compel Europe to go beyond rhetoric to action and outcomes in that space? Will Europe be prepared to overcome the tendency to promise much and deliver less? But of course, strategic autonomy and capacity and capability also reveals Europe's vulnerabilities. The first vulnerability is clearly energy. And this was done in plain sight. In fact, energy dependency on Russia has gone up, not down, over the last 10 years. How we thought that this was wise and sensible. Now, the Commission has published its Repower EU. The International Energy Agency has published its 10-point plan designed to address Europe's vulnerability. And I think that this is an area that will be addressed. But of course, we also have to be mindful that the cost of energy is driving inflation in Europe, and there is a danger with the cost of living crisis and the return of inflation that you begin to get a political backlash, and a political backlash at a time when Europe may have to confront and continuously confront a hostile Russia. There's now the debate on the Growth and Stability Pact. And I would say we must take one message from the great financial crisis, and that is a return to austerity politics and policies in Europe, given what the increases faced by ordinary Europeans, is extremely dangerous politics. And we should not go back there. And I know I'm in the Netherlands. You had a good crisis. I'm Irish. We didn't have a good crisis. But the Eurozone crisis cost too much, took too long, and generated political dynamics that we still live with. So for me, and I say this to the frugals, don't go there again. Just don't be on the wrong side of history on this one, because I would go so far as to say that the EU should expand collective borrowing in order to speed up the energy transition. That's good for energy, it's good for Europe's vulnerability, and it's good for Europe 50-50. It's good for the climate. So for me, this is there is no alternative moment, and Europe has some big choices to make. But of course, one of the other choices that faces Europe is enlargement, because the continent suffered from this extraordinary enlargement fatigue, which I fully understand, and also worry about enlargement because of the backsliding in Hungary and Poland, and assuring adequate governance in the member states, and of course the fact that Turkey became a candidate country, and there is no expectation of eventual membership just now. But Ukraine has upended enlargement. We now have 3 former Soviet republics applying to join. And what I think is absolutely remarkable, Kyiv actually filled in the Commission's questionnaire. Now, can you imagine a country at war? And it does what's needed to do in order to get an opinion from the Commission on membership. There's nothing easy about enlargement to the next wave of enlargement. The countries of East Central Europe want a strong enlargement perspective. As you drift further west in the continent, there are more and more questions. And we know that enlargement and accession to the EU is tough, arduous, takes time, is technocratic, and there's nothing easy about it. And the assumption that EU membership solves a country's problems is an illusion. EU membership is an opportunity, and countries use the opportunities with greater or lesser effectiveness. And of course, everyone sitting in the Parlement and at the European Council understands that whatever is done for Ukraine, and I think the EU would do a lot for Ukraine, has implications for the other Soviet republics and the Western Balkans. But enlargement has also always had a geopolitical dimension. So the EU has to face up to those trade-offs. And I would say it has to reimagine enlargement. And if I might sketch out, but then I think there should be a committee of wise women and men or a president's report on enlargement. It's time to look. But I think the way of thinking about it is that you can have, you use the tools of differentiated integration. But of course, differentiated integration can be multi-speed or multi-end. Now, Macron yesterday very much wanted multi-end, something called European political community. In other words, something that was in addition to full membership and in addition to the EU. Now, I had it was June or July 1991, and I remember being in Prague when Mitterrand came to Prague to persuade the Czechs, Havel, that really what the Czech, I think it was still Czechoslovakia even, but I could be wrong on my dates, came and said that really what we need is a European confederation. In other words, there's the EU and this add-on bit. So someone has dusted down Mitterrand, and it re-emerges as the European political community. I think the problem with this is that this something called affiliate membership could be very attractive to those countries who are rich and who don't want to become full member states of the EU. But I doubt it's the kind of enlargement that Zelensky is thinking about. And if I were him, I would want full membership of the club. So in my view, the multi-end is deeply problematic. But I do think one can think about blocks of different parts of EU membership that could be accessed at different times, for example, free movement or access for goods or whatever. But I do think enlargement has to be looked at very carefully. Now, finally, to collective power Europe. In my view, neither normative power nor market power Europe captures the kind of Europe that needs to meet the world we now live in. And collective power Europe is a concept that builds on the EU as a compound polity, the whole and the parts. It's not just about Brussels and the institutions, it's deeply also about the member states. And I think that provides us with an overarching concept that captures where Europe needs to go to become a more rounded, complete, and more whole international actor. In other words, the EU needs to be capable of exercising hard and soft power and translating that into what Joe Nye would call smart power. I'm not talking about power in the traditional sense, power over, command power. I'm talking about power to, the power to amass resources, instruments, and to affect outcomes. In other words, the power to do things. And market power is essential to that, but not only. So I would argue, and I'm working on a paper that will argue, that the EU has developed collective power in a pronounced way since Brexit, the pandemic, and now Ukraine. But what are the essential elements of this? Firstly, for effective collective power, the EU needs a high level of consensus. I'm not arguing for unanimity, because I think we need unanimity minus one or two. But the EU can no longer have a world in which any power, any capital, can prevent what the EU needs to do, other than, and I mean this, treaty change and enlargement. I think those are big constitutional issues and require unanimity. Then secondly, resolve matters. Europe and its member states must have the will to respond and to act and to project power and resources. And I think that relies on the EU's ability to mobilise institutional capacity, resources and knowledge. In other words, the EU needs to be a little less talking the talk and much more operational. And that capacity can involve all member states acting together, subsets of member states in whatever combination. And leadership will have to be distributed. And I think one of the interesting developments since the war in Ukraine is the way in which the eastern half of the continent rightly have inserted themselves very heavily into this debate, because of course it's existential for them. And of course, collective power also must be agile and willing to add instruments. So for me, the strapline for this EU is not unity and diversity, but Draghi's memorable phrase, whatever it takes, and it will be enough. And Europe now needs to take seriously the whatever it takes, and it will be enough. And we've just finished the conference on the future of Europe yesterday, and it'll be very interesting to see whether that conference contributes in any way to the discussion of the next phase. I'm very struck by the speed with which many capitals have come out and said no treaty change, because of course they worry about ratification. They worry about getting it through parliaments, and they worry more about referendums. The method of the convention we need to take seriously. I think the addition of those citizens' panels was very healthy. Okay, not many Europeans were involved, but for all those who participated in those citizens' panels, they had a real sense of ownership and, in a sense, that their contribution mattered. So I would say that we need to think, and the heads of government certainly need to think, what should the next phase of the Conference on the Future of Europe be, albeit knowing that it's a minor contribution, that the future of Europe is being determined largely elsewhere. But it would help, it could help, agree on what are those must-do big projects that this part of the world has no longer any choice on. So, to end, a couple of conclusions. I'm very reticent about drawing hard and fast conclusions with so much contingency and uncertainty. And war is a business that's very hard to predict. But I am convinced that normative power Europe and market power Europe may have been apposite for the post-Cold War period, but that period is now over. The easy bit of the post-Cold War is over. And collective power Europe, for me, opens up a conceptualization of the EU as a global actor that's not a scaled-up version of a nation-state or superpower, but that focuses on actions and outcomes and capacity and capability. And Europe has got to confront the tough world of hard geopolitics, address its dependencies and vulnerabilities, particularly in relation to energy, but also security. And hastening the energy transition is a very good thing. And Europe may be confronted, depending on American politics, with having to address on its own its security vulnerabilities as well. And Europe, faced with the war in the East, can't forget the instability of the South. Europe's southern neighbourhood is not a stable or robust place. And so Europe can't forget, it can't only look east, it must also look south. And there is an urgency to all of this that has never existed. I would say probably since the EU was established, but maybe that's an overstatement. And the EU can't lose sight of contemporary geopolitics, the kind of global order that is emerging. Europe must try to maintain the multilateral system, a rules-based international order, but also must be prepared when that order is breached and when that's not possible. So the EU has, it's strengthened, transatlantic relations have strengthened, but of course the EU does not want to be dominated by the United States. And in relation to China, there must be the appropriate balance between cooperation and what the EU now calls systemic rivalry. And there's all those non-aligned countries that don't want to opt decisively for either of the great powers. So again, Europe must ensure, should try to ensure that the narrative is not a West versus the rest. Of course, there is a tendency in this war for that to happen. And finally, let me end with Ukraine. We started with Ukraine. I think we, in Europe, must bear witness to the sacrifices and courage of the Ukrainian leadership, their army, their people. Europe really is blue and yellow today. There is an absolute imperative, in my view, to support Ukraine in defence of its territory and that Ukraine survives as a viable polity and economy. I don't know, there will be an opportunity, perhaps, for a negotiated settlement at some stage. It might come sooner or later. I simply don't know. I can't predict. But yet there is the outline of a deal. Ukraine does not join NATO, but gets security guarantees from European powers, and this would be linked to EU membership. But that, as I said, means that the EU must take a very hard look at enlargement as a policy and a process. And can I end by saying that only a viable and European-oriented Ukraine that represents a fundamental rejection of war and imperialism, only that will enable Europe to continue to conquer the peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Laffan, for this captivating, insightful, and very comprehensive lecture in which you dealt with very major challenges the EU faces today. Before going into the Q&A session, and we have 3 of our colleagues at the back who will be ready to provide a microphone. I would like to kick it off with a few short questions on which actually you already talked. You already talked about the danger of new dividing lines of the West versus the rest. And indeed, in this new geopolitical context, what would it take for the EU, what it needs to do as a global actor to prevent the emergence of these new dividing lines? That would be my first question.
So I think that the EU can't do this on its own, but I think we have to start from the recognition that only cooperation will save the planet. And if we're truly interested in our planet and in the generations to come, then we have no choice but to cooperate. And the climate crisis is accelerating. And so, in my view, there is no alternative to cooperation. But also, of course, climate is everything. It's everywhere from the local to the international. And it's a collective action problem from hell, because it requires so much action by so many different actors. So I would say climate is a vehicle for cooperation because it's in everyone's interest. Equally, I was very struck during the pandemic at the extraordinary cooperation across the world in science. It was amazing that we really managed to get vaccines very quickly, but that's because there was an open, well, I don't know how entirely open it was, but there was a commons when it came to vaccines. So I think we need to stress time and time again the importance of cooperation. We also, I think the WTO, lubricating the international trading system, but Europe can't be naive. So it also must have, and has, its review of trade. It certainly strengthened the trade defence mechanisms and should. So I don't think we should fetishise multilateralism, but a rules-based international order is in the interests of everyone. It gives everyone the largest and most and deepest protection. But of course, we also have to deal with the great inequalities that the world faces. So if I were an African state and I was asked to harm my economy for Ukraine, then I might not, So I think we live in one of those transition times in history where you move from one kind of order into another, but we're not quite sure what that order looks like. I suspect there will be some decoupling economically, but I'm not sure.
Yes. And my second question was exactly actually on the issue of climate, because now in an effort to reduce energy dependency, we see that there is a bit of rush back to using coal, the most polluting of the fossil fuels. And do you think this will be just a temporary setback to the green agenda of the EU?
It has to be. Yeah. Because if it's not, we're in terrible trouble. I understand what's happening because the energy vulnerability really is an Achilles heel. But of course, coal is dirty energy. So it depends on how much and how long and the damage. But it would be preferable not to have to go there.
Thank you very much. And on this note, I would like to open the floor to questions. And I want to emphasize that this should be really questions rather than comments. And indeed, I see someone here in the middle. Yes. And after that, the gentleman also on the side. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Laffan. Thank you so much for a really magnificent lecture. My name is Andre Hein. I am alumni of a diplomacy program of Leiden University. And I would like to have a question regarding the strategy compass, which you sort of started. While I do share your sentiment that the strategy compass did not really present any, let's say, solidified structures how to move forward, I was wondering what is your response to the prospect of having sort of a small unit of soldiers like this task force that should be deployed in terms of the coalition of willing in Europe and on its borders, and how do you see whether that actually plays into the earlier Macron's proposition and a few other European leaders of a European army? That means moving towards a security and defense federalization of EU. Thank you so much.
Shall we collect a few more questions, or would you prefer to
No,
answer?
whatever, I'm in your
Perhaps
hands.
there was indeed, would you be able to give the mic? It's behind you.
My name is Jaap Hoeksma, and the Twitterers among us may know me as EU spokesman. The question that the comments you made on collective power seem to indicate that we are moving into a terra incognita in the field of public international organization. And this is a problem in which both political theories and constitutional lawyers are involved, because we have to find the new and coin the new terms in order to chart this terra incognita. Now, from a legal perspective, and this is the academy is of course of international law, could it be possible to suggest that the EU is moving from a regular organization of states to transnational democracy? And could that imply that in terms of, my suggestion would be that if you try to categorize the EU in terms of existing international law, neither states nor organization of state, that you could call it a democratic international organization and bring the concept forward in that manner. Would that be useful for a political theorist?
And there was one more hand here. Yes. Yes, this gentleman. Yes.
Ja, Frits Madsen, Ambassador of Denmark. Thank you for a really excellent lecture, the best lecture that I have witnessed for a long time. I know we're not supposed to make comments, but just one very small one. A multi-speed Europe we already have, as you know, and my country opted out from a number of Maastricht elements, one of them being common defense, and we're going to vote on that on June 1st as a consequence of February 24th. And now to the question, I think you're absolutely right that when we talk about the Future of Europe conference, it will be very difficult to have treaty changes for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. You also said that there were many great ideas among what has been put forward from the citizens, and I would like to, if you could mention some of those that you think are applicable, because it is possible to make changes, to have changes in Europe without having treaty changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps if you would like, before going into another round of questions,
course.
to give you the space.
So I don't want to be overly critical of the strategic compass. I think it's a good document. I think it's a good document. I think to have given it oomph and punch, if it were accompanied by announcements of things that were already happening, I think it would sort of have taken it and it would start flying. Whereas the commitment, the coalition of the willing and the commitment to the troops is for the future, and we've already had the battle groups. So my concern is not so much the aspiration, my concern is the danger of a gap between aspiration and delivery. And to be honest, I think we're quite a way away from a European army. Firstly, because NATO is the European defence organisation. And when it comes to an army, if you have an army, you need unified command and control. And if you have unified command and control in a democracy, that implies that that there is a stronger polity than the EU now is. That doesn't mean that there won't be developments in this area, and I think much more likely in the space of coalitions of the willing. And for example, you could imagine, as I said, I'm not a defence specialist, but I imagine that there's a lot of attention being paid to the war in terms of what it means for arms and defence and drones and all AI and all this stuff. And so there I think it might not be in the technologies of the past, but you could imagine coalitions of the willing on technologies of the present and the future. So I really don't want, I don't want what I said to be interpreted as that I don't think it was a good exercise, but we've had a lot of it. On terra incognito and public international law and whether the EU is a transnational democracy and that concept helps us, I think it does. But what we struggle with in terms of the nature of the beast, the EU, is that there are two dualities in the EU. The EU is a union of states, the high contracting parties. I read the treaties, I see who signs them, but it's also a union of peoples, and it needs to be both. But then there's the second, and that is the collective and the member states, the whole and the parts. And that's why we always struggle, and why, in a sense, we're always in terra incognito with this distinctive but very particular organisation. I would say the EU is a polity. It's a political system. We can look at it in terms of the way in which centre-periphery dynamics, cleavages, developed through history. It just isn't a scaled-up version of a nation-state. And I don't think that's feasible, because we would need to look very carefully at the development of the nation-state. It's sedimented and takes a very long time. But it is a polity, and I think probably the challenge is how much centre does this polity need? How much glue, how much collective does this polity need? And politically, it must be strong enough for the EU to act and hold together, but not so strong that it strangles the member states. So I'm not an ardent, and never have been and never will be, an ardent European federalist, nor do I consider myself a cosmopolitan. I think I'm probably a liberal nationalist. In other words, that historically you can't pretend the member states of the EU aren't important and central. But in terms of thinking about what we certainly see in the EU is a strengthening of transnational dynamics. So the war in Ukraine breaks out. European publics are having the same discussions right across Europe. The pandemic, the same thing. So on, I think it'll be a very interesting referendum in Denmark. Brave. And on the conference on the future of Europe. So I think for me, I think unanimity in foreign policy has to go. I don't advocate classical qualified majority voting, because if you look at what the EU wants to do, usually you get away with unanimity -1 or 2, because I really do believe in the importance of a very high level of consensus in this field. And we also had the example, if you remember, of the migration crisis in 2015, when qualified majority rammed through a law that was simply ignored. So I think I would say in foreign policy, it should be unanimity minus 1 or 2. In other words, you need to sort Orban out. To put it in shorthand. You see, I'm not a diplomat.
Thank you very much. And Professor Gormley here.
Thanks very much, Brigid. We must have been thinking exactly along the same lines, because the question I've been going to ask you about is, what do you think is the possibility of persuading Orban, one or two others, to at least go for a constructive abstention? As we all well know, abstention doesn't prevent the adoption of measures by unanimity in any EU sector, in fact. But is that going to be something which will simply be old-fashioned horse trading? You stop the rule of law things against me, you pay lots more money so that I can distribute it to my friends. Or is it a real possibility? Or do you think we're going to be stuck because a no decision on oil boycotts and so on is just not an option? Not if we want to be taken seriously as a player on the world.
And oil is very smart, because obviously the revenues are very sizable and the vulnerabilities in Europe are less acute than with gas. On how to deal with... so I think I expect the 6 package to go through. It'll be messy, painful, but I think even Orban understands that this is one of those binary times when he can't afford to be on Moscow's side. Because if he is long-term, then he pays a price. The system has a long memory. They're already at, and I think the Commission has no choice on the rule of law. In fact, I think one of the why the rule of law crisis in the EU got out of control was he was re-elected in 2010, just as the system was completely overwhelmed with the Eurozone. And that lasted for the next 4 years. So there was too much degradation before the system woke up. And the other thing I think, and it goes back to the polity, the EU is an admixture between diplomacy and politics. And we're past diplomacy and politeness. And I do think in the European Council now there's far less politeness, and that's a very good thing. There was always a sense that heads of government had to treat each other with civility, because if they didn't, they might be at the back end of treatment. But I think that's slowly, not even slowly, I would say over the last couple of years, hard politics are far more evident in the European Council than the good old days when the world was a lot simpler and the choices were less tough. So I think if you ask me, do I think that whatever it takes wins out, usually in this EU? I hesitate to say yes, but my instinct tells me probably, because the costs of not... We think back to the single market in the mid-1980s, that famous costs of non-Europe. Well, the costs of non-Europe have just gone up again, and they're not economic, and they're not widgets. They're much more fundamental.
Thank you very much. And indeed, there was one question here on the first row on the right side, and then I see indeed 2 more hands. If we can take also those questions.
Thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. I have a question about, there was a lot of mention about European values in this talk, of course, and even at some point the imaginary of darkness, and then Europe as sort of the figure of light out of this darkness, which is now re-emerging. Of course, at the same time, we see that at Europe's southern borders and how these are being securitized or even militarized, that we're seeing structural border deaths and violence committed in name of and by the European Union. Only last week, the executive director of Frontex resigned amidst many claims of accountability and human rights abuses within the organization. So my question is a little bit, when you speak of values, and it's often Europe is sort of the global promoter of values, and if there's a value problem within the EU, it's often one that is considered as sort of an anomaly at its fringes, right? We speak of Orban and backsliding in Poland and Hungary, and that's very comfortable. But what do we do with sort of the value problems deep at the European core, and at what level is that value problem actually one that might affect Europe's both normative and strategic power in the global realm? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we also take the questions? Yeah, the other two questions there. Perfect.
Thank you as well for the great conference and being here. You're like one of my idols.
Oh God, no! I hate being.
Brief. I've been following the Future of Europe conference and the platform as a ray of light. Do you see any chance soon the ideas behind the platform being used more energetically? Because when we talk about Hungary or Poland, we use names of single politicians. But when you ask the people from those countries, they don't want democratic backsliding. When you look at the platform and how many people share the same ideas and values, it's truly amazing. So if you translate what you just told us, but it's a very limited type of public, let's say, to the language of the average citizen, and if you really explain it to them clearly, I'm sure they will support even amendment of the treaties. There should be more trust in the people of Europe, but also the people of Europe need to access that information clearly. Do you see anything done in that direction so that there's a long-term support of those policy changes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you could take the last question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your interesting lecture. And my question is basically, I share your idea completely that the European Union has to be more decisive. But you mentioned two things, especially about enlargement of the EU with Ukraine. And the second thing was the unanimity, what you mentioned. And I was thinking, aren't that hurdles for further decisiveness of the European Union? And if so, do you have ideas to overcome those hurdles? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, the one on European values is really important because what it forces us to look at is the fact that, firstly, the idea of Europe as a normative power always had a bit of hypocrisy underlying it. But politics has a lot of hypocrisy, organized hypocrisy. We tell ourselves stories. Well, even human beings, we've lots of hypocrisy. We tell ourselves stories. I think what you raise, so will Europe's border policies be driven by values only? Absolutely not. No political system has ever done that when it comes to borders in the past, and highly unlikely to do so in the future. That doesn't mean that what happens on Europe's borders that the people should not be accountable, and organisations like Frontex looked at very carefully in terms of their actions. But the idea that Europe will not strengthen its borders, given the world of mobility that we're in and will have in the future, and the challenges of the radical right, I think governments simply will balance values with preferences and interests. And I think that's probably, so if you look at states and look at the history of states, states have always, there was a very strong fight for human rights within countries. People went to the barricades, people lost their lives. But states always had and still have, in my view, the dark state is a real thing. Now, I'm not a specialist on internal security. It's not something I know a lot about. But I think we can't expect we must hold the EU to standards, but we also can't hold it to standards that are not held elsewhere. So I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm not in any way trying to diminish the importance of values, but I think values will always be tempered by other considerations. If that's... on the platform, I think the platform and the citizens' panels have been a very good experiment. They're a kind of a proof of concept. Can you bring people together to discuss the future of Europe? And I do think you're absolutely right, apart from the fact that we know empirically that you're right, that the more knowledge and information, but particularly knowledge people have about the EU, the more comfortable they are with it and the more likely they are to support initiatives. So people understanding the EU really matters. It should be a very important part of civic classes at school, but also it has to be communicated in an interesting way. And I must say that some of my most enjoyable times when it comes to communicating the EU have been standing outside supermarkets when Ireland gets to do referendums twice, where you stand there with someone with the shopping trolley, and it's the Lisbon Treaty, and it's time too, and you need to persuade this person. No, I never actually, so because I wasn't a politician, I'd always say, I'm not telling you how to vote, I'm just telling you what I think matters in this vote. So that was probably a bit of hypocrisy, but anyway. I think Europe can be communicated. And I think at least Europe is doing better now on communication than it used. My God, all those turgid reports and piled high with the green or the pink buff colour. And a language, because all political systems have insider language. And so does the EU. But I do think that communicating, but also there has been a tendency for political leaders to try to disguise the tough stuff, to pretend that, no, this treaty really doesn't mean this, but this treaty potentially can mean it, and therefore best be open. So I do think information, knowledge, and engagement really matters. People want to think that their views matter. They want to think that they have influence, and that old-fashioned term from political sociology, political efficacy. And the big danger in our democracies today are the people who don't feel any political efficacy. And we have the shock of, for example, Brexit, where people who didn't vote came out to vote because taking back control seemed a very good slogan. And on what the EU can do to overcome its hurdles, well, I think the EU is destined to disappoint. So it will always fall short of what those who want a maximalist EU want. But in my view, if it hits somewhere in the middle, then it's doing okay, because again, a lot of the democratic deficit literature, in my view, simply ignores what happens in domestic democracies and holds the EU to mythical standards that no democracy meets. That doesn't mean that we don't need to enrich the democratic processes of the EU, but more importantly, you have to have politics. You can't have democracy without politics. I do think, and back to your question of I think transnational lists might be an experiment. I don't know whether they're worth it or not, but I think the more experimentation in a democracy, the better. Particularly as we live in highly fragmented societies where the traditional transmission belts of trade unions and political parties are over. Or not over, but they're very different to what they were. We've much more volatile politics today and much more fragmented societies. But of course you can also have politics at the local, You can use new technology. So I wouldn't be pessimistic at all about democracy. I think the right to throw the rascals out has real merit. And also to be able to, we don't know what it's like to live in a society where you're being fed propaganda from one end of the day to the other. It's terrible. It's just terrible because you're effectively being brainwashed. And so I think we probably overscore the problems in our democracies and forget what it stands for. And that's why, for me, what's happening in Ukraine is so important, because here are a people, and Ukraine was not a strong democracy. I mean, it had real institutional problems with corruption. But when push came to shove, and when it was a question of domination and humiliation, or an attempt to survive and have the prospect of a Western look, and I don't mean Western look, just a democracy. And again, if you look at any indices of well-being or whatever, the democracies outperform on most indices most of the time. So I think we also need to have the confidence to reinvigorate, reimagine, but also protect what is very precious and what didn't arrive. It didn't arrive. These were hard fought. I mean, I come from a country 100 years ago that became a state. And in the interwar period, one of the few countries that remained a democracy. But that was hundreds and hundreds of years of battling and fighting. It wasn't that anything was given to, Irish democracy didn't suddenly appear overnight. And again, is a work in progress, I would say. I would be very critical of the fabric of my own country in many ways, but also recognizing the strengths.
Thank you very much, Professor Laffan, for the very interesting lecture and also for answering so thoroughly all these questions. And on this note, I would like to invite Professor Nijman for the concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Narine. And obviously, I'm standing between you and the drink, so I'll be very, very short. But allow me to thank you, Brigid, for a splendid lecture. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad you're not a diplomat, but the sharpness of your comments also during the Q&A were really very much a great joy to listen to. Thank you so much. Also for highlighting the importance of cooperation and so many other issues, but we have to end here. Narine, thank you so much for the kind moderation. Thank you. Let me thank the organizational team, Pascal, Eline, I see you at the back, Hannah, others. Thank you so much for making this possible again. Again, I'm just enjoying the packed room. Let's do this again next year. The annual lecture will then be on April 20th, and hopefully back in this room. Enjoy the drinks and all the best.